deep in the dead of night. The cold rain battered the rusted steel walls of an abandoned naval warehouse in the city's industrial district. Clara, stop. Julian's scream was a sound of absolute, biblical devastation that tore through the cavernous space. The most feared mafia boss in the city dropped his rifle and fell to his knees on the blood-stained concrete. Don't do it, please, God. Don't do it. I will find another way. Don't leave me, he begged, tears streaming freely down his bruised, bloody face as his trembling hands reached out to me. I knelt before him, the heavy steel syringe of lethal neurotoxin gripped tightly in my hand. Exactly 10 feet away, a ruthless enforcer pressed the barrel of a silver revolver firmly against the skull of my 6-year-old son, Oliver, who sat strapped to a chair, weeping in silent terror. I looked into Julian's beautiful, stormy gray eyes and offered him a genuine, completely fearless smile. You don't belong in the dark anymore, Julian, I whispered. Without breaking his gaze, I raised the syringe to the side of my neck and drove the plunger down. How did a mother hiding in the shadows force the ruthless king of the underworld to his knees? And what happens when she pays the ultimate blood debt to protect his heir? Dive into Chapter 1 to uncover the explosive truth. And hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a single deadly secret. The fluorescent lights of the St. Jude Community Pediatric Clinic flickered with a rhythmic, exhausted hum, a sound I had grown intimately familiar with over the last 4 years. The waiting room smelled of cheap lemon disinfectant, stale coffee, and the undeniable scent of anxious exhaustion that only low-income parents truly understand. I sat in a hard plastic chair, a stack of intake forms balanced on my knees, my pen moving furiously as I reviewed the files for the domestic abuse survivors I advocated for. I was Clara Hayes, though that name still felt like a heavy, borrowed coat even after 7 years. Beside my scuffed boots, sitting cross-legged on the faded linoleum floor, was the only piece of my soul that truly mattered, Oliver. At 6.5 years old, my son was a quiet observer of the world, armed with a profound empathy that terrified me. He possessed a head of thick, dark hair that refused to be tamed and striking, stormy gray eyes that were a devastating daily reminder of the man I had fled. Right now, Oliver was completely absorbed in his prized possession, a die-cast red toy car missing its back left tire. He was carefully maneuvering it over a jagged crack in the floor tiles, whispering words of encouragement to the broken toy. Easy now, Rocket, Oliver murmured, his small brow furrowed in fierce concentration. It's just a bump. We can make it over. Broken doesn't mean dead. I smiled, though my chest tightened. Broken doesn't mean dead. I had taught him that phrase when he scraped his knee last month, but hearing him apply it to a toy car struck a chord deep within my ribs. I reached down, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. He leaned into my touch instinctively, never taking his eyes off his mission. You're doing a great job navigating, Ollie, I said softly, my voice barely carrying over the cacophony of crying toddlers and coughing infants. Rocket has to be brave. Mom, he replied, looking up at me with those intense gray eyes. Because the road is very hard today. Before I could answer, the atmosphere in the clinic shifted. It didn't happen with a shout or a sudden alarm. It happened with a chilling, sudden silence. The ambient noise of a dozen restlessly simply evaporated. I looked up from my paperwork, my maternal instincts instantly flaring into a state of high alert. The heavy glass double doors of the clinic had been propped open, and the cramped, underfunded space was suddenly invaded by men who did not belong here. They wore impeccably tailored charcoal suits, their postures rigid, their eyes scanning the room with the cold, mechanical precision of predators assessing a herd. They were bodyguards, unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. And I knew exactly what to look for. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Then he walked in. Julian Vance. For 7 years. I had convinced myself that if I ever saw him again, time would have softened the sharp edges of my memory. I was wrong. If anything, the years had only carved him into something more ruthless, more unyielding. He wore a midnight black suit that absorbed the harsh clinic lighting. A dark overcoat draped over his broad shoulders. His jaw was locked tight, his expression a mask of absolute indifference. He looked exactly like what he was, the undisputed, terrifying king of the city's criminal underworld. He wasn't here for me, I knew that instantly. A cluster of nervous hospital administrators trailed behind him, flanked by a photographer. It was a PR stunt. The Vance Foundation frequently made massive, highly publicized donations to underprivileged clinics to launder their public image. He was here to sign an oversized check, take a photograph, and leave before the scent of poverty could cling to his expensive wool coat. Panic, raw and suffocating, seized my throat. Hide, the instinct was so primal it made my vision blur. I slumped down in my plastic chair, pulling the oversized collar of my faded pastel sweater up around my neck. Turning my face toward the peeling paint of the wall, I prayed to a god I hadn't spoken to in years to make me invisible. "Keep playing, Oliver," I whispered, my voice trembling so violently it cracked. "Don't look up." But Oliver, sweet observant Oliver, was already looking. The heavy polished leather shoe of one of Julian's guards had stepped squarely into the path of the red toy car. Oliver frowned, a deep V forming between his brows. He stood up, clutching his broken toy to his chest, and marched directly toward the towering wall of muscle. "Excuse me," Oliver said his high, clear voice, cutting through the suffocating silence of the waiting room like a silver bell. "You're blocking the emergency route. Rocket is injured, and you're making him wait." The guard looked down at the child as if he were a mildly irritating insect. "Move along, kid," the man growled, his voice a low, gravelly threat. He took a step forward, intending to brush past. "No," Oliver stated firmly, planting his small sneakers on the linoleum. "You are being rude. My mom says big people aren't allowed to be mean just because they are big." I tried to stand, to lunge forward and drag my son back into the shadows, but my legs flatly refused to support my weight. Terror had paralyzed my nervous system. I watched in slow, agonizing motion as the guard reached out a massive hand to push Oliver aside. "Enough, Marcus." The voice was a low, resonant baritone that sent a violent shockwave through the marrow of my bones. It was a voice that had once whispered breathless promises against my skin in the dark, a voice that I had heard scream in agony the night everything shattered. Julian stepped forward, raising a single, gloved hand. The guard instantly stepped back, lowering his head in absolute submission. Julian looked down at the boy standing fearlessly in his path. I saw the slight tightening around Julian's eyes, the subtle sign of irritation from a man who was never defied. But then, Julian did something that made the hospital administrators gasp, and the guards shift uneasily. The most feared mafia boss in the city slowly bent one knee, and then the other, lowering his towering frame until he was at eye level with my 6-year-old son. The black fabric of his expensive suit pooled on the dirty clinic floor. "I apologize for my man," Julian said, his tone surprisingly steady, devoid of its usual icy edge. "He lacks manners. Tell me about your car." Oliver studied the terrifying man with the unblinking, analytical gaze of a child who judges a soul not by a reputation, but by actions. Slowly, Oliver extended his hand, showing Julian the broken toy. "This is Rocket," Oliver explained seriously. "He lost a wheel in a terrible crash. But he's very brave. He just needs a little help getting home." Julian stared at the red car. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of something profoundly vulnerable crossed his hardened features. A ghost of a memory, I remembered, with a sickening lurch of my stomach. The nursery we had painted together 7 years ago. Julian had bought a fleet of vintage red toy cars, placing them carefully on the shelves for the baby he believed he had lost. "He looks brave," Julian said softly. He reached into his tailored pocket and pulled out a sleek, silver money clip, detaching a crisp $100 bill. "Do you think Rocket could use this for repairs?" Oliver shook his head, refusing to take the money. "Mom says we don't take things we didn't earn. Besides, money doesn't fix a broken wheel. Only glue and patience do." Julian's lips parted slightly in genuine surprise. A real, unforced half-smile broke through the ice of his expression. Your mother sounds like a very wise woman. What is your name? Little warrior. Oliver, he said proudly. Oliver, Julian repeated, the name rolling off his tongue like a prayer. It is an honor to meet you. Oliver. Oliver tilted his head, his stormy gray eyes locking onto Julian's matching ones. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of them moved. The air in the clinic seemed to thicken, heavy with an electric, invisible gravity. Oliver reached his small hand into the front pocket of his denim overalls. My heart stopped beating. I knew what was in that pocket. It was a torn, fitted half of a photograph I had thought I shredded years ago. Oliver had found it in the trash, taped it back together, and carried it like a sacred talisman. It was a picture of Julian, younger, smiling, before the darkness swallowed him whole. I had told Oliver it was his father, a man who lived far away. Oliver pulled the crumpled photograph out, looking from the glossy paper to the terrifying man kneeling in front of him. You have his eyes, Oliver whispered, his voice trembling with sudden, overwhelming emotion. Julian froze. The half-smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated confusion. Excuse me. Oliver took a tiny step forward, holding the picture out. He looked up at the mafia boss, his small face filled with a desperate, hopeful innocence that shattered the room. Are you? Papa. The silence that followed was apocalyptic. Julian did not breathe. He stared at the torn photograph of his own face. And then he looked back up at the boy, his eyes, usually cold and calculating, widened in a shock so profound it looked like physical pain. He scanned Oliver's face, the dark, unruly hair, the sharp line of his jaw, the unmistakable, piercing gray eyes that mirrored his own. The realization hit Julian Vance with the force of a detonating bomb. I couldn't hide anymore. The maternal instinct to shield my child finally overrode my paralyzing terror. I forced myself to stand, the plastic chair scraping loudly against the floor. Oliver, I gasped out, my voice raw and broken. Come here. Now, Julian's head snapped up, across the 15 feet of dirty linoleum, through the crowd of frozen guards and terrified patients. His eyes locked onto mine. The breath left his lungs in a sharp, audible hiss. He rose to his feet slowly, like a dead man waking from a 7-year slumber. He looked at my faded clothes, my tired face, and then down at the boy standing between us. I saw the exact moment the timeline connected in his brilliant, ruthless mind. 7 years ago, I had vanished. They told him I had aborted our baby. They told him I had run away with another man. He was looking at a 6.5-year-old ghost. Julian took one step toward me, his face twisting into a mask of unimaginable agony, betrayal, and a possessive, terrifying hunger. He didn't see a stranger. He didn't see Clara Hayes. He saw his wife, and he saw his son. Clara, Julian breathed, my true name sounding like a curse and a salvation all at once. Before I could grab Oliver, Julian's eyes flicked to the clipboard resting on the chair beside me. The top sheet was Oliver's emergency contact form for the clinic, in bold black ink. The date of birth was written clearly. 7 months after the day Julian was told our baby was destroyed. The king of the underworld looked back at me, the devastation in his eyes hardening into something lethal. The ghost he had mourned was breathing, and the lie he had lived was bleeding out onto the clinic floor. Do not touch him. My voice was a harsh, desperate hiss that tore from my throat before Julian could reach out. I lunged forward, grabbing Oliver by the straps of his overalls and hauling him behind my legs. I stood as a human shield between the most dangerous man on the eastern seaboard and the child he had just realized was his. Julian's hand hovered in the empty air where his son had been a second before. His fingers twitched, curling inward as if physically aching to hold something that had been stolen from him. The expression on his face was terrifying, a volatile mixture of profound grief, world-shattering shock, and a rising, volcanic fury that threatened to incinerate the entire building. Clara, Julian said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a dark, commanding resonance. Is he mine? The clinic was a tomb. The administrators had backed against the walls, their faces pale with terror. Marcus and the other bodyguards had instinctively shifted, creating an impenetrable perimeter around us, cutting off all exits. We were trapped. "Mom," Oliver whispered, his small hands clutching the back of my pastel sweater, hiding his face in the fabric. "Is he mad at me? Did I do a bad thing?" "No, baby," I said quickly, keeping my eyes locked onto Julian's. "You did nothing wrong. It's just grown-up complications. I asked you a question." "Clara," Julian repeated, stepping closer. The sheer physical presence of him was suffocating. He smelled of rain, expensive cologne, and dark secrets. "Tell me the truth, or God help me. I will tear this city apart brick by brick until I find out." I raised my chin, forcing my trembling spine to stiffen. I was not the terrified, helpless 21-year-old girl he remembered. I was a mother. "You know the answer. Julian, look at him. Look at the date on that form. He is yours." Julian closed his eyes, a violent shudder ripping through his massive frame. When he opened them, the raw vulnerability was gone, replaced by the icy, calculating boss of the Vance syndicate. "Marcus," Julian barked, not looking away from me. "Clear my schedule. Bring the armored SUV to the side exit. We are leaving. I am not going anywhere with you," I stated firmly, gripping Oliver tighter. "You can't just walk in here after 7 years and order me around. We have a life. We are leaving. And you are not following us." Julian tilted his head, his eyes darkening to the color of storm clouds. "You've vanished. You let me believe you murdered our unborn child. You let me mourn a grave that held nothing but my own sanity. You are not walking out that door, Clara. You are coming with me, both of you. Or I will have my men carry you to the car. Do not test my restraint today. I have none left." I looked at the heavily armed men surrounding us. I looked at the terrified clinic staff who would do absolutely nothing to stop him. If I fought him here, Oliver would witness a nightmare. I had spent his entire life protecting him from violence, and I would not let his first memory of his father be one of brutality. "Fine," I spat, my voice laced with venom, "but call your attack dogs off. If one of them touches my son, I will kill him myself." Julian gestured with his chin, and the guards instantly parted, creating a path to the side exit. The ride in the convoy was suffocating. Julian sat opposite us in the sprawling, luxurious cabin of the armored SUV. The windows were heavily tinted, blocking out the afternoon sun. I kept Oliver practically in my lap, wrapping my oversized, threadbare sweater around him like a fortress. It was my psychological armor, a deliberate contrast to the world of wealth and blood Julian represented. Oliver, remarkably calm for a child who had just been abducted by heavily armed men, stared at Julian with wide, curious eyes. "Are you really my papa?" Oliver asked, breaking the unbearable silence. Julian's throat bobbed. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, bringing himself closer to Oliver's eye level. "Yes, I am. Where have you been?" Oliver asked innocently. "Mom said you lived far away. Did your car break down?" Julian looked at me, a silent accusation burning in his gaze. "What lies did you feed him?" "Something like that," Julian replied softly to Oliver. "I was lost. But I found you now, and I am never letting you go." The possessive finality in his words made my stomach churn. 30 minutes later, the iron gates of a massive, fortress-like estate swung open. It was a sprawling, modern compound made of glass, steel, and cold stone, hidden behind high walls in the most exclusive zip code of the state. It wasn't the home we used to share. It was a safe house, designed for survival, not warmth. As we were ushered inside by Marcus and a team of silent staff, the sheer scale of the gilded cage became apparent. The floors were polished marble, the furniture sharp and minimalistic. It felt like a beautifully decorated prison. "Show them to the master suite." Julian ordered a maid. "Have the kitchen prepare whatever the boy wants to eat." "Wait," I commanded, stopping in the center of the cavernous foyer. I turned to face Julian, refusing to be dismissed. "Oliver, go with these ladies for a moment. Mommy needs to talk to Julian." Oliver looked hesitant but followed the maid toward the kitchen. clutching his broken red car. Once we were alone, Julian turned to me, shedding his overcoat and tossing it onto a chair. The tailored suit underneath did nothing to hide the lethal tension radiating from his muscles. "You don't own us, Julian," I said, my voice ringing clear and steady in the vast room. "You don't get to lock us in a tower and pretend the last 7 years didn't happen. You earn your place in his life. Or you walk away. I will not be your prisoner." Julian crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping inches from my face. The heat rolling off his body was overwhelming. "You think this is about ownership," he hissed, his eyes tracing the contours of my tired face, lingering on the dark circles under my eyes. "They told me you went to a clinic. They showed me your signature on the termination papers. I signed the divorce papers because I thought you despised me so much you killed the only good thing I ever helped create. Why did you run?" "Because Victoria told me you ordered it," I shouted back, the dam breaking. 7 years of suppressed terror flooding out. "Your stepmother came to my hospital room. She told me that a mob boss couldn't afford a weak, civilian wife and a liability of a child. She said if I didn't disappear, the next complication with my pregnancy would be fatal for both of us." I ran to keep him breathing. Julian stepped back as if I had driven a physical blade into his chest. All the color drained from his face. "Victoria," he whispered, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "She told me you demanded the money to leave." "I took nothing," I yelled, tears finally spilling hot and angry down my cheeks. "I lived in a studio apartment above a laundromat for 3 years. I worked night shifts, scrubbing floors so I could afford his asthma medication. I disappeared because the man I loved belonged to a family of monsters, and I refused to let them turn my son into one." Descended upon the cold foyer, heavy and suffocating. Julian stared at me, the shattered pieces of our past settling around us like toxic dust. He realized, in that agonizing moment, that neither of us had betrayed the other. We had been meticulously, brutally manipulated by the matriarch of his own empire. "I will kill her," Julian said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadened whisper. It wasn't a threat, it was a factual statement. "I will rip the flesh from her bones." "No," I stepped forward, grabbing his lapels. "You don't get to go to war. Julian, if you start a war with Victoria, the Syndicate Council will get involved. They will look for a weakness. They will look for Oliver. I didn't survive 7 years in the dark to let you bury my son in it now. You protect him by keeping this quiet. We figure this out together. Without guns." Julian looked down at my hands clutching his suit. Slowly, he reached up, his large, calloused fingers wrapping gently around my wrists. He didn't pull away. He just held me, anchoring me. "This house is impenetrable," he promised, his voice softening just a fraction. "No one knows you are here. My personal guard, men loyal only to me, surround the perimeter. You are safe tonight, Clara," I swear it on my life. I wanted to believe him. God. My weary soul ached to lean into his broad chest and let someone else carry the unbearable weight of survival for just one night. But the instinct of a hunted animal is hard to break. That evening, I bathed Oliver in a marble tub the size of a small swimming pool. I dressed him in soft, ridiculously expensive silk pajamas Julian had somehow managed to have delivered within the hour. I tucked him into a massive, king-sized bed, sitting beside him as he placed Rocket carefully on the nightstand. "Is this our new house, Mom?" Oliver asked, his eyes heavy with sleep. "Just for a little while." "Sweetie," I murmured, kissing his forehead. "I like Papa," he mumbled, his eyes drifting shut. "He looks sad, but he has a nice voice." My heart fractured a little more. I stayed in the dark room long after his breathing leveled out into the steady rhythm of deep sleep. The silence of the safe house was unnerving. I was used to the rumble of traffic, the shouting of neighbors through thin walls. Here it was a sterile, isolated vacuum, needing a glass of water to soothe my dry throat. I slipped out of the master suite and padded softly down the expansive, dimly lit hallway toward the modern kitchen. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the sprawling grounds, completely swallowed by the night. I could faintly see the silhouettes of Julian's guards patrolling the perimeter. I was supposed to feel safe. I turned on a small pendant light over the kitchen island, reaching for a crystal glass. As I filled it with water from the tap, my eyes caught a faint, unnatural glow coming from the far end of the marble counter, near the butler's pantry. It was a phone. Not one of the sleek smartphones Julian and his men carried. It was a cheap, plastic burner phone. Sitting perfectly square on the pristine counter, my stomach plummeted. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. Julian wouldn't leave a burner phone lying around in a highly secured house. My hand trembled violently as I reached out and picked it up. The screen was lit up with a single, unread text message. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct screamed at me to drop the device and run back to Oliver's room. But I pressed the button. The screen illuminated my terrified face in the dark kitchen. The message was short, clinical, and devastating. Such a cute kid. Muddy bloodlines don't survive in this family. Clara, you should have stayed dead. I dropped the phone. It clattered loudly against the marble counter, sounding like a gunshot in the silent house. The sanctuary was a lie. The impenetrable fortress was compromised. Someone inside this house. Someone wearing Julian's uniform and standing outside my son's door. Belonged to Victoria. The illusion of safety I had allowed myself to feel for 3 short hours shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The ghost of my past hadn't just found me. The monsters had followed him right to my doorstep. The cold, unforgiving marble of the kitchen island seemed to absorb all the heat from my trembling hands. I stared at the cheap plastic burner phone, the malicious text message glowing like a radioactive isotope in the dim light. Muddy bloodlines don't survive in this family. Clara, you should have stayed dead. The air in my lungs turned to shattered glass. The sanctuary was an illusion. The fortress was a trap. Victoria Vance was not a ghost of the past. She was the architect of my present nightmare, and she had eyes inside this very house. I did not scream. 7 years of hiding had taught me that panic was a luxury I could not afford. Instead, I snatched the phone from the counter, my fingers wrapping around the cheap plastic so tightly my knuckles turned white. I spun around, fully intending to sprint back to the master suite, to barricade the door, to grab Oliver and climb out the window if I had to. But before I could take a single step, the heavy mahogany doors of the kitchen swung open. Julian stood framed in the doorway, barefoot, wearing only a pair of dark suit trousers. His chest was bare, revealing a map of faded scars, a testament to a violent life I had tried so desperately to escape. He saw my face, saw the stark, bloodless terror etched into my features, and his entire demeanor shifted instantly from cautious host to lethal predator. What happened? His voice was a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. I didn't speak. I simply threw the burner phone at him. He caught it effortlessly out of the air. His eyes dropped to the glowing screen, scanning the short, devastating message. I watched as the temperature in the room plummeted. The muscles in his jaw tightened until I thought the bone would snap. The veins in his neck pressed against his skin, thick with a suddenly boiling rage. "Marcus," Julian roared, the sound tearing through the quiet house like artillery fire. Within seconds, the kitchen was flooded with armed men. Marcus, Julian's massive, stone-faced second-in-command, stepped forward, a submachine gun already strapped across his chest. "Lock down the perimeter," Julian commanded, his voice eerily calm now, a deadly contrast to the shout a moment before. "No one enters. No one leaves. Strip every guard of their communications. There is a rat in my house, and I want him found and brought to the cellar before the sun comes up." "Julian, we have to go," I interrupted, moving past the guards. "We have to take Oliver and leave right now. If she got a phone in here, she can get a weapon in here." Julian reached out, catching my arm. His grip was firm but surprisingly gentle. "You are safer here than anywhere else in the world. Clara, we are heavily fortified. No one can breach this compound by force." He was wrong. The universe has a cruel sense of irony. And Victoria Vance did not use force. She used the law. A sharp, piercing alarm echoed through the estate. But it wasn't the frantic wail of a perimeter breach. It was a rhythmic, solemn chime. Marcus looked down at a tablet he pulled from his tactical vest, his face draining of color. He looked up at Julian, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in the giant man's eyes. Boss, Marcus swallowed hard. It's not an attack. It's a visitation. Julian's grip on my arm loosened. Who, the commission? The words meant nothing to me, but to Julian. They were a death sentence. He cursed in rapid, violent Italian, releasing my arms and striding toward the grand foyer. I followed him, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Through the massive, bulletproof glass of the front entrance, I saw them. A fleet of 6 immaculate black SUVs had pulled into the circular driveway. They had not breached the gates by force. Julian's men had opened them. Why did your men let them in? I demanded. Panic risings in my throat as figures in dark coats began to step out of the vehicles. Because they are the ruling council of the syndicate, Julian said, his voice hollow. By the ancient laws of Omerta, the blood oath, turning them away is an act of treason. It is a declaration of war. Julian pushed open the heavy front doors. Stepping out onto the sprawling portico, I stood just inside the threshold, watching the nightmare unfold. The men who emerged from the SUVs were not thugs. They were elderly, impeccably dressed patriarchs with cold, unblinking eyes. They moved with the slow, terrifying grace of men who held the power of life and death over millions. And stepping out of the center vehicle, flanked by 2 towering enforcers, was the devil herself. Victoria Vance was a striking woman in her late 50s, her silver hair pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon. She wore a tailored white coat that seemed to glow in the darkness, a stark contrast to the black suits surrounding her. She looked exactly as she had 7 years ago in my hospital room, untouched, superior, and utterly venomous. Julian, darling, Victoria called out, her voice smooth and melodic, laced with a maternal affection that made me want to vomit. You really should answer your phone. We had to come all this way in the middle of the night. Victoria, Julian growled, his hands balling into fists at his sides. Marcus and 20 of Julian's elite guards fanned out across the portico, their hands resting on their holstered weapons. But they did not draw them. Stand down, boys, Victoria said softly, not even looking at the armed guards. She approached the steps. Shupman standing alongside the 3 elderly bosses of the commission. We are not here for violence. We are here for family. You have no family here, Julian stated, taking a step down to block her path. Leave my property. One of the elderly bosses, a man with a heavy oak cane, stepped forward. You forget yourself. Julian, you rule the Vance Empire. But the Empire answers to the Syndicate. And the Syndicate is governed by the laws of our fathers. Omerta, I have broken no laws, Julian said, his jaw rigid. No, you haven't, Victoria agreed, a wicked smile playing on her lips. She finally looked past Julian, her icy blue eyes locking onto me standing in the foyer. But she has. My breath hitched. 7 years ago, a civilian woman was permitted into our circle, Victoria announced to the commission, her voice projecting clearly in the night air. When the pressure became too much, she abandoned her husband. She faked an abortion, stole the Vance bloodline, and hid the heir to one of our greatest families like a common thief. By our sacred laws, an unvetted outsider, a traitor to the family, cannot raise the heir to the empire. The boy must be brought into the fold. He must be re-educated. You are not touching my son, I screamed, stepping out onto the portico. Entirely forgetting my fear, I moved to stand beside Julian, staring down the woman who had ruined my life. You forced me out. You threatened to kill him before he was even born. Victoria sighed, looking at the elders with a look of manufactured pity. You see, the civilian is hysterical. She spins lies to cover her theft. A mother who would steal a child from his father is unfit to raise a king. He is not a king. He is a 6-year-old boy, I shouted, tears of pure rage blurring my vision. Julian stepped in front of me, shielding me from their view. He looked at the elders. The boy stays with me. He is my blood, I claim him. And I claim the mother. The matter is settled. The man with the cane shook his head slowly. You do not dictate the laws. Julian, the boy has lived in the dark for 6 years. He does not know our ways. He does not know discipline. The commission has decreed that the child will be placed under the guardianship of Victoria Vance. She will ensure he is raised with the respect and the ruthlessness required of his bloodline. If the mother surrenders him peacefully, she may walk away with her life. Over my dead body, Julian snarled, finally drawing his weapon. The metallic slide racking loudly in the quiet night. Behind him, Marcus and the 20 guards drew their weapons simultaneously, creating a terrifying wall of steel aimed directly at the commission. For a second, I thought we had won. I thought Julian's power was absolute. But Victoria did not flinch. She simply smiled. If you pull that trigger, Julian, Victoria said softly, her voice carrying an absolute, chilling certainty. You break the blood oath. You declare war on the entire syndicate. Every family on the eastern seaboard will descend on this house. You might kill us, but thousands of men will come for you. And when they do, in the chaos, who will protect the little boy sleeping upstairs? Who will protect the fragile little civilian cowering behind you? Julian froze. You can die a rebel, Julian, Victoria whispered. But your son will die with you. That is the price of war. I looked at Julian. I looked at the broad, invincible shoulders I had thought could shelter us from anything. I saw those shoulders slowly, agonizingly drop. I saw his hand tremble as the impossible weight of his own toxic empire crushed the breath from his lungs. He was the most feared man in the city, but he was a prisoner to the crown he wore. If he fought, Oliver died in the crossfire. Julian, I whispered, my voice breaking. Please, no. Julian turned to look at me. His eyes were shattered glass. The absolute devastation in his expression was worse than any physical wound. He looked like a man who was cutting out his own heart. Marcus, Julian choked out, the word tearing his throat. Lower your weapons. Boss hesitated in shock. Lower your damn weapons. Julian roared, the sound echoing with profound agony. The guards slowly lowered their guns. The illusion of safety, the illusion of Julian's power, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. A wise choice. Victoria purred. Behind me, the front door opened. I spun around to see 2 of Victoria's men carrying Oliver out of the house. He was still in his silk pajamas, clutching his red toy car, crying out in confusion and terror. Mom, Oliver screamed, kicking his small legs. Mom, help me. Papa, Oliver. I lunged forward, but Marcus caught me around the waist, holding me back. I fought him with every ounce of strength in my body, clawing at his arms, screaming until my vocal cords bled. Let me go. Give him back. Julian, do something. Do something. Julian stood frozen on the steps, his hands shaking, his gun lowered. He watched as they carried his son toward the black SUVs. He watched as Victoria smiled triumphantly. He watched as the doors slammed shut, trapping my weeping child inside the metal cage. I collapsed against Marcus, my legs giving out. My sobs tearing through the quiet night as the convoy reversed out of the driveway, taking my entire universe with it. I looked up at Julian, the man who had sworn on his life to protect us. He had let them take him. The crushing, absolute disappointment was a physical weight on my chest. Julian Vance was not a king. He was just a pawn on Victoria's chessboard, and I was the fool who had briefly believed we were safe. The silence in the safe house was apocalyptic. It was a suffocating, heavy void left behind by the violent tearing away of a child from his mother. In Julian's grand, mahogany-paneled office, that silence was being systematically destroyed. A heavy crystal decanter shattered against the stone fireplace, raining amber liquid and sharp shards across the Persian rug. The massive oak desk was overturned, papers and files scattered like dead leaves in a hurricane. Julian was tearing his own sanctuary apart, his bare chest heaving, his knuckles bloody and raw from punching the plaster walls. He was a caged beast, consumed by a feral, impotent rage. I sat perfectly still on a leather sofa in the corner of the room, untouched by the destruction. I was not crying anymore. The frantic, hyperventilating terror that had possessed me on the portico had burned away, leaving behind something entirely new, something cold, calculating, and terrifyingly clear. I watched the most dangerous man in the city throw a tantrum because his guns and his titles had failed him. I will mobilize the northern factions, Julian snarled to Marcus, who stood silently by the door. We strike the commission's headquarters at dawn. I don't care about the oath. I will burn the city to the ground to get him back. If you do that, Julian, I said, my voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. It was so steady, so devoid of emotion, that it made Julian freeze mid-stride. Victoria will execute Oliver before your men even breach the front gates. You know she will. Julian turned to me, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with grief. Then what do you suggest? Clara, we sit here. We wait for them to brainwash him, to turn my son into a monster for their own amusement. I cannot let her have him. I stood up slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from my faded pastel sweater. I felt an odd sense of detachment from the frightened, passive woman I had been all evening. The maternal instinct is a funny thing. It can paralyze you to protect a child in your arms, but once that child is taken, it transforms into an absolute, lethal focus. You don't understand how the world works, Julian, I said, walking toward him, my bare feet stepping carefully over the broken glass. You think power is about who has the most guns, who yells the loudest, who sits at the head of a mahogany table. That's how men fight. And that is exactly why Victoria outmaneuvered you tonight. She used your own laws against you. I am out of diplomatic options. Julian gritted his teeth. I have to use force. You are going to use force. I agreed, stopping inches from him. But you are not going to charge in blindly and start a war. We need to know exactly where they took him. Not just the building, the room, the guard rotations, the security blind spots. Victoria holds him at the ancestral compound, Julian said, running a bloody hand through his dark hair. It's a fortress. 50 armed men, state-of-the-art surveillance. I have no eyes inside that house. Anyone loyal to me was purged from her staff years ago. I looked at him, feeling a sudden, strange surge of superiority. You have no eyes inside that house, Julian, but I do. Julian frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. What are you talking about? You've been hiding in a studio apartment for 7 years. I turned away from him and walked to the corner of the room where Marcus had placed a secure, encrypted laptop. I flipped it open, my fingers flying across the keyboard. Bypassing the superficial security protocols I had watched Julian's men use earlier. For 7 years, I said, not looking at him, I ran a community haven for domestic abuse survivors. Women who were beaten, broken, and discarded by men who thought they were gods. Women who had nowhere else to go. I hid them. I fed them. I helped them get new identities. I logged into a hidden, encrypted server I had built myself, navigating to a heavily guarded messaging board disguised as a knitting forum. Do you know what happens to women who escape violence but have no money and no education? Julian, I asked, my voice echoing in the quiet room. They take the jobs no one else wants. They become maids. They become waitresses. They become the night shift cleaners. They wear uniforms that make them completely invisible to men like you. And men like the commission. I began typing a message. A simple coded distress signal I had established years ago. The sanctuary is breached. The little bird is taken by the silver wolf. Need eyes in the forest. You think a network of abused women can penetrate the syndicate? Julian asked, his voice a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope. Your men carry guns, Julian, I said, finally turning to look at him. My women carry secrets. They change your sheets. They pour your scotch. They empty your trash. You never look at their faces, which means they see absolutely everything. Let's see which is deadlier. For the next 2 hours, the safe house office transformed into a command center. Julian and Marcus watched in stunned silence as my encrypted screen began to light up. Responses flooded in. Maria, I am on shift at the ancestral estate. They brought the boy in 20 minutes ago. Elena, he is in the East Wing, 3rd floor. The old nursery. Rosa, they have 4 guards on the corridor. 6 on the perimeter. The cameras in the west stairwell have a 30-second blind spot during the shift change at 4:00 a.m. I transcribed the information rapidly, drawing a crude but fiercely accurate blueprint of Victoria's impenetrable fortress on a large sheet of paper I found on the floor. I mapped out the guard patrols, the camera blind spots, the exact path to the East Wing nursery. I was not a hostage anymore. I was a general leading an invisible army. I walked over to Julian's overturned desk, cleared a space, and slammed the blueprint down in front of him. Here is your ward, Julian, I said, my voice ringing with absolute authority. At 4:00 a.m. the shift changes. You have a 30-second window to breach the west stairwell without triggering the alarms. You bypass the main corridor. Take the service elevator, which Maria is keeping propped open with a linen cart, and you go straight into the East Wing. Julian stared at the meticulously detailed map, his jaw slack. The most powerful man in the criminal underworld was being handed the keys to his enemy's castle by a civilian woman he had underestimated for 7 years. He looked up at me, his gray eyes burning with a sudden, overwhelming awe. You are incredible, he whispered, the words carrying the weight of a religious revelation. I am a mother, I corrected coldly. Get your men ready. We leave in 20 minutes. Julian stood up quickly. Clara, no. It's too dangerous. You stay here. I will bring him back. Do not ever give me an order again. I snapped, stepping into his personal space, refusing to back down. Victoria took because she thinks I am weak, because she thinks a civilian is a liability. I am going to walk into her house, and I am going to take my son back. I am commanding this operation. You and your men are just the muscle. Julian stared at me, the ghost of the terrified 21-year-old girl completely erased, replaced by a woman forged in fire. Slowly, he nodded, stepping aside. Marcus, gear up. We follow Clara's lead. As Marcus moved to leave the room, he paused, holding a manila folder he had pulled from the encrypted servers while Julian was adjudging. Boss, Marcus said, his voice hesitant. Before we go, while we were securing the digital perimeter, I tasked the tech team to dig into Victoria's personal offshore servers. You ordered me to find the rat, but I found something else. Marcus walked over and placed the folder on the desk beside my blueprint. Julian frowned, opening the folder. Inside were high-resolution printouts of medical documents and legal filings. I didn't need to read the fine print to know what they were. The clinic logo was printed boldly at the top. What is this? Julian asked, his voice tight. It's the digital footprint, boss, Marcus explained quietly. The metadata from the clinic's server. It proves the timestamps on the abortion consent forms were altered retroactively. The signature is a digital composite, perfectly forged. The same goes for the divorce decree. Victoria paid a private intelligence firm $2 million to fabricate the entire paper trail 7 years ago. Julian stopped breathing. His hands, still bloody from punching the walls, hovered over the paper. He stared at the forged signature, my signature, the lie that had haunted his nightmares for 2,500 nights. He traced the ink with a trembling finger. All this time, beneath his rage, a tiny insidious voice had whispered that perhaps I really had destroyed our baby. Perhaps he had been too monstrous, too suffocating, and I had chosen to end a life rather than share it with him. Victoria had planted that seed of doubt, and he had watered it with his own self-loathing. Now the undeniable truth was laid bare in black and white. I had never betrayed him. I had never stopped loving our child. We had been slaughtered on the altar of Victoria's ambition. Julian's knees buckled. The king of the underworld collapsed onto the floor, falling to his knees right there amidst the broken glass and scattered files. He grabbed the edges of the desk, his massive shoulders shaking violently as a guttural, tearing sob ripped from his chest. It was the sound of a man mourning the 7 years of life, of birthdays, of quiet mornings and shared laughter that had been stolen from him by his own flesh and blood. I stood above him, looking down at the man who terrified millions, now weeping on his knees in front of me. I felt the anger that had sustained me for 7 years begin to crack. I didn't want to forgive him. I wanted to hold on to my righteous fury. But seeing him broken, seeing the agonizing realization of how thoroughly we had both been victimized, I couldn't hold on to the hate. I slowly dropped to my knees in front of him. I reached out, my hands trembling, and placed them on either side of his face. His skin was hot, wet with tears. He leaned into my touch, burying his face in my palms, a broken boy seeking absolution. "I'm sorry." Julian choked out, his voice a shredded whisper. "God, Clara, I am so sorry. I should have looked harder. I should have known you wouldn't. I should have protected you. You couldn't know." I whispered back, my own tears finally falling, mixing with his. She orchestrated a masterpiece of lies. "Julian, we were just kids. We didn't know how dark the dark really was." He looked up at me, his gray eyes swimming in agony and a desperate, beautiful love. "I will spend the rest of my life making this right. I swear to you, Clara, I will give you the world." "I don't want the world, Julian," I said, my voice hardening, the general returning to the forefront of my mind. I wiped the tears from his cheeks with my thumbs. "I want my son. Gather your men. We have a castle to storm." The ancestral estate of the Vance Syndicate was not merely a house. It was a sprawling, Gothic fortress built on a century of blood money and buried secrets, looming against the night sky like a jagged shadow. Its stone walls were lined with state-of-the-art thermal cameras and patrolled by men who shot first and asked questions later. But as we crouched in the damp, freezing underbrush at the edge of the property line, I did not feel the paralyzing terror that had gripped me in the clinic. I felt the icy, calculating precision of a mother who was about to tear down a castle to reach her child. Julian knelt beside me, his face painted in the black grease paint of a night raid, his suppressed tactical rifle held tightly against his chest. Behind us, Marcus and 12 of Julian's most elite, fiercely loyal operators waited in absolute silence. They were highly trained killers, but tonight, they were taking their orders from a woman in a faded pastel sweater. I checked the illuminated dial of Julian's tactical watch. 3 minutes to 4 in the morning. "The perimeter shift change is about to begin," I whispered, my voice barely carrying over the rustle of the wind through the pines. The thermal cameras on the west wall sweep in a 45-degree arc. When the guard turns the corner to light his cigarette, which Rosa assured me he does every single night, we will have exactly 30 seconds to scale the retaining wall and breach the service door. Julian looked at me, his eyes gleaming in the dark. There was no hesitation in his gaze, only a profound, unwavering trust. He gave a sharp, silent hand signal to his men. We moved as one single, predatory organism. The guard appeared on the parapet above, a dark silhouette against the moonless sky, just as Rosa promised. He paused, turning away from the wind to cup a lighter around a cigarette. The brief flare of orange light was our signal. We surged forward. Julian hoisted me over the retaining wall with effortless strength, and we sprinted across the manicured lawn toward the heavy steel service door. I held my breath as Marcus slipped a customized decryption key into the electronic lock. The light blinked green, the door swung open without a sound. We slipped into the dimly lit, sterile service corridors of the mansion. The air smelled of expensive floor wax and old stone, according to my blueprint, generated by the invisible army of abused women working in this very house. We needed to bypass the main security hub entirely. "The service elevator," I breathed, pointing down a narrow hallway. As we approached, the elevator doors stood wide open. A terrified but resolute maid named Maria stood beside a large canvas laundry cart, holding the manual override button. When she saw me, surrounded by heavily armed men, her eyes widened, but she did not flinch. She had survived a husband who broke her ribs. She was not going to break under the pressure of a mafia raid. I stepped into the elevator, placing a hand gently over hers. "Thank you, Maria," I whispered fervently. "You have no idea what you've done for us tonight. Disappear now. Use the emergency fund I set up." Maria nodded, tears shining in her eyes, and slipped past us into the shadows of the corridor. Julian pressed the button for the third floor. The ascent was agonizingly slow, the mechanical hum of the elevator amplifying the frantic beating of my heart. When the doors finally parted, we stepped out into the opulent, velvet-lined hallway of the East Wing. Two guards stood outside the heavy oak doors of the old nursery. They didn't even have to reach for their weapons. Julian and Marcus moved with terrifying, lethal synchronization, neutralizing the men with swift, silent blows to the temple, lowering their unconscious bodies to the carpet before they could make a sound. I didn't wait for the perimeter to be secured. I threw open the nursery doors. The room was dark, filled with antique wooden toys and heavy drapery. In the center of the room, curled into a tight, trembling ball on a massive four-poster bed, was Oliver. He was clutching his broken red toy car to his chest, his face buried in the pillows. "Oliver," I sobbed, rushing across the room and falling to my knees beside the bed. He bolted upright, his stormy gray eyes wide with disbelief before he threw his arms around my neck, burying his face in my shoulder. "Mom, you came. I knew you would come. I've got you. My brave boy," I cried, crushing him to my chest, inhaling the sweet, familiar scent of his hair. "I'm right here. Mommy's right here." Julian stepped into the room, his massive frame filling the doorway. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and crossed the room, dropping to his knees beside us. He wrapped his massive arms around both of us, pulling us into a fiercely protective embrace. Oliver looked up from my shoulder, his small hand reaching out to touch Julian's face. "Papa came too," Oliver whispered. "I will always come for you," Julian vowed, his voice trembling with a raw, desperate emotion. "I will burn the world down before I let anyone take you from me again." We extracted from the estate as silently as we had entered, slipping back into the night before Victoria's security apparatus even realized the heir to the empire was missing. By dawn, we were back at Julian's fortified safe house. But Julian was not satisfied with merely escaping. The revelation of the forged abortion and divorce documents had ignited a righteous, unquenchable fire in his soul. He wanted Victoria to pay, and he wanted to legitimize his son in front of the entire underworld, against my warnings. Julian demanded an emergency session of the commission to be held at a neutral syndicate stronghold, a massive, fortified warehouse district controlled by the neutral elders. I stood beside Julian in the cavernous, steel-beamed warehouse, holding Oliver tightly against my side. Marcus and Julian's loyal men flanked us, standing at attention. Across the polished concrete floor sat the commission, the 5 elderly patriarchs of the syndicate, seated behind a long mahogany table. Victoria stood confidently beside them, wearing a tailored charcoal suit, her expression one of mild, condescending amusement. Arthur Sterling, her lethal enforcer, lurked in the shadows behind her. "You called this emergency session." Julian, the head elder, a man named Donna Telly, rasped, leaning heavily on his cane. "You defied our decree and stole the boy back. Explain yourself before we declare a blood feud." Julian stepped forward, his presence commanding the vast room. He did not look like a man on trial. He looked like a king reclaiming his throne. He threw a thick manila folder onto the center of the table. "I stole nothing." Julian's voice echoed off the steel rafters. "That folder contains undeniable, digital proof that Victoria Vance orchestrated a massive fraud against this family 7 years ago. She paid a private intelligence firm to forge abortion clinic documents and a divorce decree to force my wife into hiding. She lied to me. She lied to the family. And she nearly destroyed the true heir to the Vanson's empire to consolidate her own power." The elders frowned, pulling the documents toward them. For a brief, intoxicating moment, I thought we had won. I thought the truth, backed by undeniable metadata and digital footprints, would finally break Victoria's stranglehold on our lives. But Victoria did not panic. She did not scream or deny the allegations. She simply let out a low, musical laugh that chilled the blood in my veins. "Oh, Julian," Victoria sighed, shaking her head with theatrical pity. "You always were too ruled by your heart. Did you really think I forged those documents simply because I hated a civilian? I did it to protect you. I did it to protect the syndicate from a devastating scandal." Julian's eyes narrowed. "What lies are you spinning now?" Victoria signaled to Arthur. The enforcer stepped forward and handed a sleek tablet to the elders. He then tapped a button on a remote, and a massive projection screen unrolled from the ceiling, illuminating the dark warehouse. "I didn't forge an abortion to get rid of your heir, Julian," Victoria said, her voice dripping with venomous triumph. "I forged it to cover up the fact that you're precious. Innocent wife was carrying the bastard seed of our greatest enemy. The boy is not yours, you lying bitch," Julian roared, stepping forward, his hand dropping to his sidearm. Marcus immediately stepped up beside him, weapons drawn. "Watch the screen, Julian," Victoria commanded. The projector flared to life. The video footage was incredibly crisp, resembling a high-end surveillance feed from a luxury hotel suite. And there, on the massive screen, was my face. I was younger, wearing a dress I remembered owning 7 years ago. I was sitting on the edge of a bed, and sitting next to me, his hand resting intimately on my thigh, was Diego Moreno, the ruthless head of the rival Moreno cartel. The audio kicked in. The voice was mine, possessing my exact cadence, my exact tone. "Julian is too controlling." The digital version of me whispered on the screen, leaning into the rival boss. "He'll never let me go if he knows I'm pregnant with your child. Diego, we have to make him believe I terminated it." I stopped breathing. The warehouse spun violently around me. "That's not real," I screamed, my voice cracking in pure, unadulterated horror. "That never happened. I've never even met that man. Julian, it's a deep fake. It's computer-generated." But Victoria wasn't finished. Arthur dropped a second stack of documents on the elder's table. "Medical records, gentlemen," Victoria announced smoothly. "Taken from the boy while he was in my custody last night. A direct DNA comparison. The boy carries 0% of the Vance bloodline. He is a Moreno. She planted a rival's bastard in your house, Julian, hoping to eventually inherit your empire." The elders stared at the DNA results, their faces turning to stone. In the world of the Mafia, blood is the only currency that matters. A muddy bloodline is an absolute abomination. The seed of a rival cartel is an act of war. Julian stared at the screen, then at the DNA test. I saw a flicker of devastating confusion cross his face, and for one agonizing second, I thought the technology had successfully poisoned his mind. But then Julian turned, looking at Oliver, who was crying silently into my sweater, and then he looked into my eyes. He saw my terror. He saw my truth. He knew with absolute certainty that I had never betrayed him. "It's a fabrication," Julian snarled, turning back to the elders. "It's a digital lie. Look at the data I gave you. She pays to forge documents. Your documents prove nothing but your desperation to believe a whore," Donatelli spat, rising to his feet, his cane trembling with rage. The atmosphere in the warehouse shifted from a tribunal to an execution chamber. The omerta is clear, the bloodline is contaminated, the woman is a spy for the Moreno cartel, and the boy is an enemy asset. "He is my son," Julian roared, pulling his weapon and aiming it squarely at Donatelli's chest. It was the fatal mistake Victoria had been waiting for. By drawing on the elders, Julian broke the ultimate taboo. Suddenly, the sound of 50 weapons being racked echoed through the warehouse. But they weren't Victoria's men. They were Julian's. I watched in absolute, crushing horror as the elite operators who had stormed the castle with us just hours ago, the men who had sworn loyalty to Julian, slowly turned their weapons away from Victoria and aimed them directly at Julian's back. In the syndicate, loyalty to the blood oath supersedes loyalty to the boss. If the boss protects a rival's bastard, the boss must be put down. Only Marcus remained at Julian's side. his massive frame shielding me and Oliver. His weapon trained in his own former comrades. "Stand down," Julian, Victoria commanded, her eyes blazing with absolute victory. "You are stripped of your title. You are no longer the head of this family. You are nothing. Julian, please," I begged, clutching his arm, tears blinding me. "Please, put the gun down. They'll kill you. They'll kill Oliver." Julian looked around the room, realizing the trap had snapped shut with flawless, inescapable precision. The empire he had sacrificed his soul to build, the power he believed could protect us, was entirely useless against a fabricated lie that manipulated their archaic traditions. He looked at me, a profound, agonizing apology in his eyes. Slowly, deliberately, Julian dropped his weapon. It clattered against the concrete floor. "Take him," Donatelli ordered. Arthur and 4 heavy enforcers rushed forward. Marcus tried to intervene, but a brutal strike from a rifle butt dropped the giant man to his knees. I screamed as they grabbed Julian. They didn't just arrest him. They exacted the brutal physical punishment demanded by the syndicate for treason. Arthur delivered a crushing blow to Julian's abdomen, dropping him to his knees, followed by a vicious kick to his face that sent blood spraying across the concrete. "Stop, stop it," I shrieked, throwing my body forward, but 2 guards caught my arms, pinning me back. Oliver was sobbing hysterically, burying his face in his hands. Julian did not fight back. He took every brutal, bone-crushing strike in absolute silence. His eyes locked onto mine the entire time, silently telling me to stay back, to stay safe. He absorbed the violence meant for us, trading his physical body to keep them away from his family. When they finally stepped back, Julian was a ruined, bloody mess on the floor, gasping for air, his custom suit torn and stained crimson. Victoria walked gracefully over to him, looking down at her defeated stepson. "You chose a whore and a bastard over the crown," she whispered coldly. She turned to Arthur. "Give them the exile mandate." Arthur pulled a silver pocket watch from his vest. "You have 24 hours to leave the country," the enforcer stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "If you, the woman, or the boy are found on American soil after sunrise tomorrow, you will be executed on sight. The Vance Empire is closed to you." The guards released me. I collapsed onto the floor beside Julian, pulling his bloody head into my lap, my hands desperately pressing against his bruised face. He coughed, a wet, agonizing sound, but his hand reached up, his bloody fingers wrapping weakly in my sweater. "I've got you," I sobbed, rocking him as Oliver clung to my back. Weeping, "I've got you." "Julian," I looked up at Victoria, who was walking away, flanked by the elders who had just handed her the keys to the kingdom. My heart was crushed under the weight of this peak disappointment. We had fought back. We had used the truth. But in a world built on toxic traditions and manipulated bloodlines, the truth was just another casualty of war. The empire had fallen, and we were entirely, terrifyingly alone. The drive north was a silent, agonizing blur of asphalt and rain. Marcus, possessing a fractured rib and a bruised jaw, drove the heavily armored SUV with ruthless efficiency, breaking every speed limit to put distance between us and the city. In the back seat, Julian lay with his head resting heavily in my lap. He was a canvas of purple bruises and dried blood, his breathing shallow and ragged. I held a bag of melting ice against his swollen left eye, my other hand tightly grasping Oliver's small fingers. My son had exhausted himself with crying and was now curled against my side, sleeping a fitful, twitching sleep. Julian had lost his empire, his army, and his name. Yet, as he looked up at me through his one unswollen eye, I didn't see the hollow devastation of a defeated king. I saw something entirely unfamiliar, something that stripped away the terrifying aura of the mafia boss and left only a deeply wounded, intensely devoted man. "I failed you," Julian rasped, his voice barely a whisper over the hum of the tires. "I promised to protect you with my power, and my power is what nearly got you killed. Your power was a cage." "Julian," I said softly, brushing a lock of dark hair from his bruised forehead. "For you as much as for me. They used your own laws to break you. But you didn't fail us. You took the beatings so they wouldn't touch Oliver. You are alive. We are together. That is all that matters. We have 18 hours. Marcus called gruffly from the driver's seat, checking his rearview mirror for the 100th time. Where are we going? Boss. The syndicate controls every major port and airfield on the eastern seaboard. If we try to fly out, they'll intercept us. Julian closed his eyes, taking a slow, painful breath. Head to Maine, to the jagged coast near Bar Harbor. I have an asset there. It was purchased through a shell company 10 years ago, under a fictitious name. It's completely off the syndicate's grid. Not even Victoria's accountants know it exists. We can regroup there and arrange private maritime transport to Europe. 6 hours later, we arrived at the edge of the world. The hidden property was perched precariously on a jagged cliff overlooking the furious, churning expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The air was sharp, tasting heavily of salt and pine needles. The house itself was a stark contrast to the sterile, modern fortress of the safe house. It was a beautiful, sprawling cedar shingle cottage, weathered by the sea winds, featuring a wraparound porch and massive windows that faced the crushing waves. It looked like a home. It felt like a deep, cleansing breath after years of drowning. Inside, the house was dusty but fully stocked. Marcus immediately began securing the perimeter, relying on his training rather than technology to fortify the property. I helped Julian to the master bedroom, carefully stripping away the ruined remnants of his tailored suit. I cleaned his wounds with surgical precision, a remnant of my medical training from a lifetime ago. As I taped his bruised ribs, he winced, but his eyes never left my face. You look beautiful in this light, Julian whispered, catching my wrist as I applied a bandage to his cheek. I paused, feeling a sudden, overwhelming rush of heat flood my chest. For 7 years, I had viewed this man as a phantom, a terrifying memory that haunted my nightmares. But here, stripped of his suits, his weapons, and his terrifying title, wearing only a plain gray t-shirt and sweatpants, he was just Julian, the man who used to read medical textbooks aloud to me while I studied, the man who had painted a nursery red and gold. You look terrible, I countered softly, though a small, genuine smile broke through my exhaustion. The next 48 hours were a surreal, fragile illusion of peace. The deadline to leave the country came and went. But Julian's hidden wealth and Marcus's intense counter-surveillance protocols ensured we remained a ghost in the system. The sheer isolation of the Maine coastline, wrapped in thick morning fog and the constant roar of the ocean, acted as a psychological blanket. For the first time in 7 years, I didn't wake up checking the locks on my doors. On the third morning, the coastal illusion reached its peak. I woke up to the smell of something burning. Panic flared briefly before I heard the unmistakable sound of Oliver's giggles echoing from the kitchen. I threw on a thick wool cardigan over my pajamas and padded down the hardwood hallway. I stopped in the doorway, my heart expanding until it physically ached in my chest. Julian, the former terrifying king of the underworld, was standing at the stove, wearing an apron that read "Kiss the Cook." He was attempting to flip a pancake, his bruised face twisted in fierce concentration. Oliver was standing on a stool beside him, holding his red toy car and acting as the head chef. You flipped too early, Papa, Oliver advised seriously, pointing the red car at the smoking pan. The bubbles weren't popping yet. Now it's going to be squishy in the middle and burnt on the outside. I am executing a highly complex culinary maneuver, Oliver, Julian grunted, trying to scrape the ruined batter off the pan with a spatula. It requires finesse. It requires fire insurance. Marcus muttered deadpan from the kitchen table, where he was cleaning a disassembled handgun, though a rare, genuine smile touched the giant enforcer's lips. I leaned against the doorframe, watching them. The scene was so profoundly domestic, so hilariously normal, that it brought tears to my eyes. This was the life that Victoria had stolen from us. This was the man Julian was supposed to be, before the syndicate demanded he become a monster. Julian looked up and saw me standing there. He abandoned the ruined pancake, wiped his hands on a towel, and walked over to me. He didn't say a word. He just wrapped his arms around my waist, pulling me tightly against his chest, burying his face in the crook of my neck. I closed my eyes, wrapping my arms around his broad shoulders, breathing in the scent of smoke, sea salt, and him. I could stay here forever, Julian murmured against my skin. I don't care about the empire. I don't care about the money. I just want this. I just want you and him. That evening, the illusion felt permanent. The sun began to set, painting the sky in violent streaks of violet and gold. Oliver was outside on the wraparound porch, driving his broken red car along the wooden railing, making quiet engine noises. Juliet and I sat on a weathered wooden bench nearby, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, watching the waves crash against the jagged rocks below. I spent my entire life believing that blood dictated destiny, Julian said quietly, his arm firmly around my shoulders. Victoria raised me to believe that the Vance bloodline was sacred, that it made us superior, but it was a lie to control me. Look what blood did. It betrayed me. It forged documents. It lied. It tore my family apart. Family isn't about genetics, Julian, I said, leaning my head against his shoulder. Family is built on respect, sacrifice, and truth. It's not about manipulated bloodlines and toxic traditions. You proved that when you dropped your gun in that warehouse. You chose us over the crown. That makes you more of a king than Donatelli will ever be. Julian turned to me, his gray eyes shining with an intensity that took my breath away. He reached up, cupping my cheek. Slowly, he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't the frantic, desperate kiss of a man going to war. It was slow, deeply tender, and filled with a profound reverence. It was a promise of a new beginning. I kissed him back, letting go of the last remnants of my fear, allowing myself to truly believe that the darkness was finally behind us. The kiss was interrupted by a vibration, not a phone buzzing, but a deep, rhythmic vibration that seemed to rattle the very floorboards beneath our feet. Julian pulled back, his brow furrowing. He looked up at the sky. The twilight had deepened into darkness, but the rhythmic sound was growing louder, rapidly escalating from a distant hum to a deafening, mechanical roar. Thwack, 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 thwack. Helicopters. Julian breathed, his body instantly going rigid. The peaceful domestic father vanishing in a millisecond, replaced once again by the lethal survivor, Marcus, before Julian could even stand up. The power to the entire house was brutally severed, every light extinguished in an instant, plunging the property into absolute blackness. Oliver, I screamed, tearing myself away from Julian and sprinting toward the far end of the porch, where my son had been playing just moments before. The roar of the helicopter blades was deafening now, vibrating in my teeth. Suddenly, a blinding, high-intensity spotlight cut through the darkness from the sky, washing the wooden porch in a harsh, clinical white glare. The downdraft from the rotors whipped the coastal wind into a violent frenzy, throwing patio furniture across the deck. Oliver, where are you? I shrieked, blindly fighting against the gale force wind. My hand scrambling over the wooden railing, I reached the corner of the porch. Oliver was not there. Instead, illuminated perfectly by the blinding spotlight from the sky, lay a small, tragic object. I dropped to my knees on the wooden deck, my hands shaking violently as I reached out. It was Oliver's red toy car, but it was no longer just broken. It was completely charred and melted, the plastic warped into a grotesque, blackened lump. A deliberate, horrifying message. Clara, get down. Julian roared over the noise, diving across the porch and tackling me to the wooden planks just as the sharp, terrifying crack of sniper fire echoed over the sound of the ocean. The wooden railing where I had just been standing splintered into 1,000 pieces. Victoria hadn't just ordered us into exile. She knew Julian would eventually realize the deepfake was a lie and come back for vengeance. She hadn't sent the commission to arrest us. She had sent an elite mercenary strike team to wipe us off the face of the earth. The coastal illusion shattered like a fragile pane of glass. The nightmare had not ended. It had simply relocated to the edge of the world. and in the deafening, blinding chaos of the ambush, as bullets began to tear the cedar cottage apart. The most agonizing realization of all ripped through my soul. They had Oliver again. The wooden planks of the porch exploded into deadly splinters around my face as Julian tackled me to the ground, his heavy body acting as a human shield against the rain of sniper fire. The deafening roar of the helicopter blades above us whipped the coastal wind into a violent hurricane, tearing the cedar shingles from the roof of our supposed sanctuary. I could not breathe. I could not scream. The image of Oliver's charred red toy car was seared into my retinas, a horrifying brand on my soul. They had taken him. In the brief, agonizing seconds I had taken to close my eyes and believe in a future. Victoria's monsters had crept onto the porch and stolen the beating heart from my chest. "Move," Julian roared, hauling me up by the collar of my cardigan. He did not ask if I was unhindered. There was no time for tenderness in a war zone. We sprinted back into the darkened house just as the large bay windows shattered inward, showering the hardwood floor with a million lethal diamonds of glass. Marcus was already in motion, a massive, terrifying shadow in the dark. He laid down a wall of suppressing fire with his assault rifle through the broken windows, the muzzle flash illuminating the grim, bloody determination on his face. Julian shoved me toward a hidden trapdoor beneath the kitchen island, a smuggler's hatch that Marcus had discovered and prepared during his counter-surveillance sweep. "Down," Julian commanded, practically throwing me into the narrow, earthen tunnel beneath the floorboards. He followed immediately, pulling the heavy metal grate shut just as the front door of the cottage was blown off its hinges by a breaching charge. We scrambled through the damp, claustrophobic darkness of the tunnel, the sound of boots and shouting echoing faintly above us. The tunnel emerged in a dense grove of pine trees a quarter-mile down the jagged coastline, where Marcus had hidden a heavily armored, unmarked SUV under camouflage netting. The moment the heavy steel doors of the vehicle slammed shut, the adrenaline that had kept me moving evaporated, leaving behind a crushing, paralyzing despair. "Oliver," I choked out, my hands tearing at my own hair. "Julian, they took him. They took my baby. That charred car." It was a message. Julian's face was a mask of pure, absolute murder. He slammed his fist against the reinforced dashboard, so hard the digital display cracked. "I will kill her. I will tear her heart out while it is still beating." He turned to Marcus, who was already firing up the engine and tearing through the dense forest brush, ignoring the lack of a road. "Get us comms. I need eyes on the city. I need to know where Arthur's extraction team took him." Marcus tapped rapidly on a mounted encrypted laptop. "Boss, we have a massive problem. The syndicate network is flooding with chatter. Victoria isn't just hunting us. She's executing a purge." "What kind of purge?" Julian demanded, reloading his sidearm with mechanical precision. "She is eradicating everything connected to Clara," Marcus said, his voice grim. The giant man looked at me through the rearview mirror, his eyes filled with a heavy sorrow. "Clara, your secure server. It's lighting up with distress signals. It's a coordinated strike." I grabbed the laptop from the center console, my shaking fingers struggling to type in my decryption keys. When the screen finally loaded, the sheer volume of emergency alerts made my stomach violently heave. Victoria had realized how I had breached her ancestral estate. She had realized I had built an invisible army of women to circumvent her power. And now she was punishing them for it. "Maria," I whispered, reading the frantic, broken messages on the hidden forum. Maria was intercepted on her way home. They pulled her into an alley. She's in critical condition at the free clinic. They beat her within an inch of her life as a warning to the others." Julian reached out, his hand hovering over my shoulder. But he did not touch me. He knew there was no comfort he could offer that would mitigate this guilt. "Clara, I am so sorry. It gets worse," Marcus interrupted, pushing the armored SUV onto the main highway, accelerating to a reckless, terrifying speed. Police scanners in the city are going wild. A massive structural fire has just been reported in the South District. multiple engine companies responding. I felt the blood drain entirely from my face. The South District. Give me the address, I demanded, my voice turning into a hollow, mechanical drone. Marcus read off the street coordinates. It was my community center, the sanctuary I had spent years building with my bare hands. The underground haven where 50 abused women and their children were currently sleeping, believing they were safe from the violent men who hunted them. Victoria had ordered it burned to the ground simply because it belonged to me. She is burning them alive, I breathed, a horrific, suffocating panic rising in my throat. Julian, the women are in there. There are children in there. We can't go there. Clara, Julian said firmly, grabbing my shoulders and forcing me to look at him. Victoria wants us distracted. She is burning your center to draw us out. Arthur is moving Oliver to a secure location right now. We have to intercept him before they put him on a plane or a boat and disappear forever. We have to choose Oliver. I cannot let 50 women and children burn to death because of a war you brought to my doorstep, I screamed, thrashing against his grip. The moral agony was tearing me apart, splitting my soul down the middle. My son, my beautiful, innocent son, was in the hands of a monster. But the women in that building, the women who had risked their lives to give me the blueprints to save Oliver just a day ago, were screaming in the flames. Julian, I begged, tears streaming down my face. They helped us. Maria bled for us. If we let them die, we are no better than Victoria. We are the monsters she says we are. Please, please. We have to save them. Julian stared into my eyes. The cold, calculating mafia boss warring with the man who was desperately trying to find his own humanity. He looked at the tears tracking through the dirt on my face, and he saw the unshakable, agonizing conviction in my soul. I would never forgive myself, and I would never forgive him. If we walked away from those women. Julian's jaw locked. He looked up at the rearview mirror. Marcus, divert to the South District. Step on it. Boss, if we lose Arthur's trail, I said divert. Julian roared. We save the women. Then we find my son. When we arrived at the community center, the night sky was choked with thick, black smoke. The old brick building was engulfed in a terrifying inferno, flames licking fiercely out of the shattered windows. Fire trucks were already on the scene, but the police had formed a barricade, holding back the frantic crowds. The fire was too intense. The structural integrity of the roof was already beginning to collapse. I didn't wait for Marcus to completely stop the vehicle. I threw open the heavy door and sprinted toward the barricades. My people are in there. I screamed at a police officer who tried to grab my arm. There is a reinforced basement. The fire escapes on the east wing are welded shut by the abusers they ran from. You have to cut them open. The officer ignored me, pushing me back aggressively. Ma'am, get back. The building is lost. I saw a face in a second-story window through the thick smoke. A young mother, clutching a baby wrapped in a blanket, screaming for help that could not reach her. The firefighters' ladders were deployed on the wrong side of the alley. Blocked by burning debris, Victoria's men had deliberately placed there to trap them. I'm going in, I said, my voice dead and resolute. I pulled away from the officer and sprinted toward the burning service entrance. I didn't make it 2 steps before Julian caught me, his massive arms wrapping around my waist, lifting my feet off the ground. Are you insane? He bellowed over the roar of the fire. You will die in there. Clara, you cannot help them if you are dead. Let me go. I fought him with feral, desperate strength. That is my legacy. That is my family. I will not let Victoria erase them. Julian spun me around, slamming his hands onto my shoulders, shaking me once. Hard. Look at me. You are a general. Clara, generals do not die in the fire. They lead. Tell me where the structural weaknesses are. Tell me how to get to the basement. Marcus and I will go. I stared at him, stunned, the mafia boss, a man who had built an empire on the broken bodies of others, was offering to run into a burning building to save sins he did not know, simply because I loved them. He was shedding the toxic skin of the syndicate right in front of my eyes. The East Alley. I choked out, pointing through the smoke. There is a reinforced steel door. It leads directly to the basement stairwell, but it's chained from the outside. Marcus, Julian commanded, not taking his eyes off me. Grab the breaching tools from the trunk. We are going to work for the next 20 minutes. I witnessed a miracle forged in the fires of hell. Julian and Marcus did not fight like gangsters. They fought like saviors. They bypassed the useless police barricades, plunging into the suffocating, toxic smoke of the East Alley. I heard the deafening roar of Marcus's breaching shotgun, blowing the heavy chains off the steel door. Through the thick haze, I saw Julian emerge again and again, his tailored shirt burned and soaked in soot, carrying terrified women and crying children in his massive arms, handing them off to the paramedics before diving straight back into the inferno. He pulled 12 people from the basement, just moments before the first floor collapsed into it in a spectacular, horrifying shower of sparks and crushed concrete. When Julian finally stumbled out of the alley for the last time, carrying the young mother and her baby I had seen in the window, he collapsed onto his knees on the wet asphalt. He was coughing violently, his skin smeared with ash and blood, his lungs ruined by the smoke. I ran to him, dropping to the ground and throwing my arms around his neck, burying my face in his soot-stained chest. "You saved them," I sobbed, holding him as tightly as my trembling arms would allow. "Julian, you saved them." He wrapped his arms around me, burying his face in my hair, his chest heaving with exhaustion. "I told you," he rasped, his voice sounding like crushed gravel. "I will give you the world, Clara, even if I have to pull it out of the fire." Marcus jogged over, his face equally blackened by the smoke. Holding the encrypted tablet, the giant enforcer looked down at us, a profound, unwavering respect shining in his eyes. He had served a boss for 15 years. But tonight, he realized he was finally serving a king. "Boss," Marcus interrupted gently, "I have a ping on Arthur's vehicle." He didn't go to the airport. He took the boy to the abandoned naval shipyards on the edge of the industrial district. Julian's eyes snapped open. The tenderness vanished, replaced instantly by the lethal, calculating predator. He pushed himself to his feet, pulling me up with him. He looked at the burning ruins of my community center, at the terrified but living women being treated by paramedics. And then he looked down at his ruined, bloody hands. "Victoria wanted to break your spirit tonight, Clara," Julian said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. "She wanted to show you that she could burn your legacy to ashes, but she made a fatal miscalculation." "What?" I asked, my voice trembling as the adrenaline spiked again. Julian pulled a fresh magazine from his tactical vest and slammed it into his weapon, the metallic click echoing with lethal finality. "She forgot that we are the ones who rule the dark. Let's go get our son." The abandoned naval shipyard was a sprawling, rusted graveyard of maritime industry. Massive, skeletal cranes loomed against the dark, rainy sky like the bones of dead leviathans. Shipping containers were stacked in chaotic labyrinths, creating a tactical nightmare of blind corners and elevated sniper positions. It was the perfect place to hide an army, and the perfect place to execute a king. Marcus parked the armored SUV a half-mile away, hidden beneath the crumbling concrete of an overpass. We approached the main warehouse on foot, moving through the torrential rain in absolute, terrifying silence. Julian moved with a fluid, lethal grace I had never witnessed before. The mafia boss who had ruled from mahogany desks was gone. This was the street soldier who had clawed his way to the top of the underworld with his bare hands. As we reached the perimeter of the massive corrugated steel warehouse, Marcus held up a fist. He pointed to 3 faint red dots dancing on the wet asphalt near the entrance. "Laser sights. They have the high ground." Marcus whispered over the tactical comms we had equipped. "At least 24 shooters on the catwalks inside. It's a kill box. Boss, if we walk through those doors, we will be cut to ribbons before we take 10 steps. Arthur knows we are coming," Julian replied softly, his gray eyes in the rusted exterior of the building. "He wants us to walk through the front door. We give him what he wants, but not how he expects it." Julian turned to me, his expression softening just enough to break my heart all over again. Claire, I need you to stay behind this container. Do not move until the shooting stops. No, I said, grabbing his arm, my fingers digging into his soaked shirt. I am not hiding while you die for him. We do this together. You are a general, Clara, but this is a slaughterhouse. Julian pleaded, his voice thick with desperation. If I fall, you are the only one left to save him. Please, let me be the monster they built me to be for 5 more minutes. I looked into his eyes, seeing the absolute, undeniable truth. I was an advocate, a survivor, a mother, but I was not a killer. If I walked into that crossfire, I would become a liability that would get Julian and Oliver killed, slowly, agonizingly. I nodded, stepping back into the deep shadows of the stacked shipping containers. Julian kissed my forehead, a lingering, desperate press of his lips against my skin. Then he and Marcus moved. They didn't kick the front doors open. They scaled the rusted exterior siding with terrifying speed, accessing a shattered skylight on the roof. I waited in the rain, my heart hammering so violently against my ribs I thought it would shatter my sternum. The silence was unbearable. Then all hell broke loose. The muffled, rapid-fire staccato of suppressed automatic weapons echoed from within the warehouse, followed immediately by the deafening roar of unsilenced return fire. Flashes of light strobed through the dirty, cracked windows. I heard shouts, the sound of bodies hitting metal grating, the unmistakable, sickening thud of lethal combat. I pressed my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, praying to a god I still wasn't sure was listening to protect the man who was fighting for my soul. The gunfire lasted for what felt like an eternity, but in reality, was likely less than 3 minutes. Then, a heavy, suffocating silence descended over the shipyard once more. I couldn't wait. The maternal instinct overrode all logic and promises. I stepped out from the shadows and ran toward the slightly ajar side door of the warehouse, slipping inside. The interior was a chaotic nightmare of smoke and blood. Bodies of Victoria's mercenaries littered the concrete floor and the elevated catwalks. Marcus was slumped against a steel pillar near the entrance, bleeding heavily from a gunshot wound to his thigh. But he was alive, holding his weapon steady. And in the center of the vast, empty space, illuminated by a single, harsh industrial floodlight, was my son. Oliver was strapped securely to a metal chair, crying silently, his small face pale with terror, standing directly behind him, with the barrel of a heavy silver revolver pressed firmly against the back of Oliver's head, was Arthur Sterling. The enforcer looked completely unfazed by the slaughter around him. 10 feet away, Julian stood frozen. He was bleeding from a graze on his cheek, his assault rifle aimed squarely at Arthur's face. "Put the gun down, Julian," Arthur said smoothly, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "You know how fast my finger is. You might take my head off, but my reflex will pull this trigger before my brain registers the bullet. The boy dies. If you hurt him," Arthur Julian rasped, his voice vibrating with a demonic, absolute fury. "I will keep you alive for a month. I will peel the skin from your bones an inch a day." "I don't doubt it," Arthur replied calmly. "But I don't take orders from you anymore." Suddenly, the massive digital screen on the far wall of the warehouse flared to life. The harsh blue light illuminated the blood-stained concrete. Victoria Vance's face appeared on the monitor, sitting comfortably in what looked like the leather chair of Julian's own executive office. She was sipping a glass of wine, watching the feed from the warehouse security cameras with a look of supreme satisfaction. "Bravo, Julian," Victoria applauded slowly, her voice crackling over the warehouse PA system. "You tore through my mercenaries like the feral dog I trained you to be. But brawn will never defeat intellect. You are trapped in my web, exactly where I wanted you. Let the boy go." "Victoria," Julian demanded, not taking his eyes off Arthur. "You have the syndicate. You have my money. You have my empire. You won, I surrender it all. Just let my son walk out of here." "Oh, Julian," Victoria sighed, her face twisting in mock sympathy. You still don't understand the rules of the game. The commission demanded the eradication of the muddy bloodline. As long as the boy breathes. My position is insecure. The elders will question my resolve. The boy must die to solidify my reign. I stepped out from the shadows, unable to stay hidden any longer. Please, I screamed, running forward until Julian shot his arm out, physically barring me from getting any closer to Arthur's gun. Victoria, please. He's just a little boy. He doesn't know anything about your empire. Let me take him away. We will leave the country. We will change our names. You will never see us again. Victoria's eyes shifted on the monitor, looking down at the camera that was feeding her my image. Slow, deeply wicked smile spread across her face. Clara, Victoria purred, the resilient little civilian. You certainly caused a lot of trouble tonight. My accountants are still trying to scrub the financial damage you did by burning down that pathetic charity center. But I am a merciful queen. I am willing to offer you a trade. Arthur used his free hand to reach into his coat pocket. He pulled out a sleek, stainless steel syringe, filled with a thick, iridescent blue liquid. He tossed it onto the concrete floor. It skittered across the ground, stopping exactly halfway between Arthur and Julian. What is that? Julian growled, his eyes darting to the syringe. A highly concentrated neurotoxin. Victoria explained calmly over the speakers. Colorless, mostly painless. It induces massive cardiac arrest within 60 seconds of injection. It leaves no trace in the bloodstream. It will look exactly like a stress-induced heart attack brought on by the tragedy of losing your legacy. Victoria leaned forward, her face filling the massive screen, her eyes locking onto mine with terrifying, absolute malice. Here is my offer. Clara, the commission demands blood to pay for the treason of a corrupted heir. I don't care whose blood it is. If you pick up that syringe and inject it directly into your own neck, right now, in front of the cameras, I will order Arthur to drop his weapon. The boy and the disgraced boss can walk out of here alive. You pay the blood debt, and your son lives. No, Julian roared, lunging forward. But Arthur immediately pressed the revolver harder against Oliver's skull. Oliver squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a terrified whimper. Julian froze, his entire body trembling violently with the desperate, impossible agony of a caged animal. Julian, Victoria warned coldly. If you take one more step, Arthur fires. If you try to shoot the syringe, Arthur fires. The choice belongs entirely to the mother. Let's see just how much you love your bastard son. Clara, I stared at the silver syringe resting on the cold, blood-stained concrete. The silence in the warehouse was absolute, broken only by the sound of the rain drumming against the steel roof. I looked at Arthur, his dead, unblinking eyes promising exactly what Victoria threatened. I looked at Oliver, my beautiful, innocent boy, strapped to a chair in a slaughterhouse, his small chest heaving with silent, terrified sobs. He had his father's eyes, but he had my heart. I had fought for 7 years to keep him breathing. I had hidden in the dark. I had scrubbed floors. I had lived in terror every single day, all to ensure this boy had a chance at life. There was no choice to make. I stepped forward. Clara, stop. Julian screamed, his voice cracking, shedding all pretense of the mafia boss, sounding only like a desperate, terrified man. He dropped his rifle, reaching out with both hands, trying to grab my sweater, but I expertly twisted out of his grip. Don't do it. Please, God, don't do it. I will find another way. I will kill them all. Don't leave me. I walked to the center of the floor and knelt on the cold concrete. My fingers closed around the cold steel of the syringe. It felt heavy, loaded with the absolute finality of death. Clara Julian fell to his knees beside me, his hands hovering over mine, afraid to touch the needle, afraid to trigger Arthur's gun. Tears were streaming freely down his bruised, bloody face. The most feared man in the city was begging me on his knees, his soul shattering right in front of my eyes. Please, I just found you. I just got you back. I cannot live in the dark again. I will give her the empire. I will give her my life. Just put it down. I looked into Julian's beautiful, stormy gray eyes. I saw the ghost of the boy I had loved 7 years ago. And I saw the man who had just run into a burning building to save strangers for me. He had finally become the father Oliver deserved. He didn't need my protection anymore. You don't belong in the dark anymore, Julian, I whispered, reaching up with my free hand to cup his cheek. My thumb brushing away a tear that mixed with blood. I smiled, a genuine, completely fearless smile. You are going to take our son to the coast. You are going to teach him how to make those terrible pancakes. And you are going to tell him every single day that his mother loved him more than she loved breathing. No, Julian sobbed, shaking his head frantically. No, Clara. Please, I turned to look at Oliver. I held his terrified gaze, pouring every ounce of love, strength, and courage I possessed into that final look. I love you, my brave little warrior, I said clearly. Rocket is going to need you to fix him. Be brave for Mama. Before Julian could react, before my own survival instinct could stop my hand, I raised the syringe to the side of my neck and drove the plunger down. The cold liquid flooded into my veins like liquid ice. No, Julian's scream was a sound of absolute, biblical devastation. A roar of agony that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. I dropped the empty syringe. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then the fire started. It started in my chest. A crushing, suffocating weight that radiated outward, paralyzing my lungs. The edges of my vision instantly began to blur, tunneling into a thick, gray static. My knees gave out. I fell forward. But I did not hit the concrete. Julian caught me, dragging my collapsing body into his lap, his arms wrapping around me like a vice. Arthur, drop the gun. She did it. Drop the damn gun. Julian roared at the enforcer, his voice tearing his vocal cords. I saw Arthur, through the rapidly darkening tunnel of my vision, slowly lower the revolver and step away from Oliver. Victoria had kept her word. The blood debt was paid. Clara, Julian wept, pressing his face against my cheek, rocking me back and forth on the bloody floor. Stay with me. Please, look at me. Breathe. Come on, breathe. I tried to speak, to tell him it was okay, to tell him to take Oliver and run. But my lips wouldn't move. The paralysis had reached my throat. The pain in my chest was absolute, an explosive pressure that signaled the catastrophic failure of my heart. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me completely was Julian's face above me. The desperate, agonizing grief in his eyes was suddenly, terrifyingly eclipsed. As my heart stopped beating in his arms, the man I loved vanished. In his place, looking up at Victoria's monitor with eyes that held the cold, infinite void of a true monster unchained, was the king of the underworld, and he was going to burn the world to ashes. Death did not feel like a sudden drop into an abyss. It felt like a slow, suffocating submersion into a frozen lake, where the sounds of the living grew muffled and distant before disappearing entirely. I remembered the burning in my chest, the terrifying paralysis, and the agonizing sound of Julian's shattered scream. I had closed my eyes, fully prepared to never open them again, trading my final breath for the absolute certainty that my son would keep his. But then the darkness began to recede. It did not retreat peacefully. It was torn away by a blinding, clinical light and the rhythmic, electronic blare of a heart monitor. I gasped, my lungs inflating with a sharp, violent intake of air that tasted of sterilized alcohol and iodine. I shot upright, my hands frantically reaching for my throat, searching for the puncture wound. A firm, massive hand gently caught my wrists, holding them down against the crisp white sheets of a hospital bed. Easy, Clara. A deep, gruff voice commanded softly. Your heart rate is spiking. Breathe. You are safe. The boy is safe. I blinked rapidly, the harsh fluorescent lights of the underground medical facility coming into focus. Marcus sat in a metal chair beside my bed, his massive frame hunched forward. He was still wearing his tactical gear, though his thigh was heavily bandaged, blood seeping through the white gauze. Oliver, I choked out, my voice raw and entirely unrecognizable. Julian, where are they? What happened to the toxin? Marcus released my wrists, leaning back with a heavy sigh. You didn't take a neurotoxin. You took a concentrated dose of a synthetic paralytic combined with a heavy beta blocker. It drops your heart rate to near zero and completely paralyzes the respiratory system within 60 seconds. To the naked eye and to a security camera, it mimics a fatal cardiac arrest flawlessly. I stared at the giant enforcer, my brain struggling to process the information through the heavy fog of the drugs. Arthur tossed the syringe. Victoria watched it happen. Arthur tossed the syringe he pulled from his right pocket. Marcus corrected, a grim, humorous smile touching his lips. Before we breached the warehouse, while I was securing the perimeter, I had a brief, physical altercation with Arthur's quartermaster. I knew Victoria's playbook. I knew she would try to force Julian into an impossible choice. So I swapped the contents of the syringes in Arthur's primary tactical vest. Victoria thought she was watching you die. Arthur thought he was watching you die. Julian still thinks you are dead. My heart, which had been artificially slowed just hours ago, slammed violently against my ribs. Julian thinks I'm dead. Marcus, where is he? Where is my son? I secured Oliver, Marcus assured me quickly, pointing to a secure steel door at the end of the medical bay. He is sleeping in the next room, guarded by the only 3 men left in the syndicate I trust with my life. He is unharmed. But Julian, Marcus's stoic expression faltered, a shadow of genuine terror passing over his hardened features. When you collapsed, Clara, something inside Julian broke completely. He didn't grieve. He didn't cry. He became a monster. He ordered me to take the boy and disappear. Then he walked out into the rain alone. Where did he go? I demanded, tearing the IV from the back of my hand, ignoring the sharp sting of the needle. He is marching on the commission, Marcus said, his voice dropping to a grim whisper. He is going to Victoria's penthouse. He intends to slaughter the elders, Arthur, Victoria, and every mercenary standing in his way. He doesn't care if he dies. He wants to burn the entire empire to ashes to avenge you. If he pulls the trigger on the elders, the other cartels will use the chaos to wipe out the Vance family forever. Julian is walking into a suicide mission. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed. The lingering effects of the paralytic made my muscles tremble, but the adrenaline surging through my veins burned away the weakness. I had not survived a forced exile, a burning building, and a lethal injection to let the man I loved throw his life away in a fit of apocalyptic vengeance. Get me my clothes, I ordered, my voice finding its strength, ringing out with cold, absolute authority. Your clothes were covered in blood and industrial runoff from the warehouse, Marcus noted, standing up despite his wounded leg. He walked over to a metal locker and pulled out a garment bag. I had one of your contacts from the community center bring this. She said you would need it. I unzipped the bag. Inside was not the oversized, faded pastel sweaters I had used for 7 years to hide my body and my spirit. It was a sharply tailored, blood crimson trench coat, paired with a fitted black turtleneck and dark trousers. It was the armor of a woman who was done hiding. It was the visual manifestation of a queen who was ready to reclaim her board. I dressed quickly, the heavy, expensive fabric settling over my shoulders like a mantle of power. I walked over to the secure laptop Marcus had set up on a stainless steel medical cart. I logged into my encrypted server. The network was alive with the frantic, digital whispers of my invisible army. Julian wants to use bullets, I said to Marcus, my fingers flying across the keyboard, initiating a protocol I had spent years building in secret. Bullets are messy. They create martyrs. They start wars. We are not going to fight Victoria with violence. We are going to execute her with the truth. I authorized the data dump. Across the city, in the opulent mansions of the commission elders, in the private clubs of rival cartels, and in the heavily guarded server rooms of the FBI and the IRS, my invisible army struck. Maids slipped USB drives into secure mainframes. Waitresses hit send on hidden, encrypted servers. Decades of Victoria's most guarded secrets, the human trafficking manifests she kept off the official syndicate books. The offshore embezzlement accounts where she stole from the commission. The extortion tapes she used to blackmail federal judges. were simultaneously blasted to every major news outlet, federal agency, and rival mafia boss on the eastern seaboard. "It's done," I said, closing the laptop with a sharp snap. I turned to Marcus, who was staring at me with a reverence usually reserved for deities. "Take me to the penthouse. We have an execution to attend." Victoria Vance's penthouse was a triplex of glass and marble suspended above the city skyline, a monument to her untouchable ego. When the elevator doors slid open on the top floor, the scene before me was a tableau of absolute carnage. The heavy mahogany doors were blown off their hinges. Victoria's elite personal guards lay scattered across the polished marble floors, neutralized with ruthless, brutal efficiency. I stepped over the shattered glass, the crimson hem of my coat sweeping silently across the blood-stained floor. In the center of the sprawling, panoramic living room, the climax of Julian's vengeance was unfolding. The 5 elders of the commission were huddled in a corner, their arrogance entirely stripped away, replaced by the pathetic, trembling fear of old men facing death. Arthur Sterling was on his knees, his face unrecognizable, gasping for air through a crushed jaw. And standing over Victoria was Julian. He was soaked in rain and blood, his tactical gear torn, his breathing heavy and ragged. He held a heavy silver pistol aimed directly at Victoria's forehead. Victoria was sitting on her white leather sofa, her pristine white coat stained with the blood of her guards. She was trapped, but she was still smiling. A wicked, defiant smirk that dared Julian to pull the trigger. "Do it, Julian," Victoria taunted, her voice echoing in the shattered room. "Kill me. Avenge your little civilian whore. But know this, the moment my brain paints this sofa, the syndicate falls. The feds will swarm this building. And you will spend the rest of your pathetic, broken life rotting in a black site, remembering how you failed her." Julian's hand was shaking, not with hesitation, but with the sheer, uncontrollable magnitude of his grief. His finger tightened on the trigger. "You took my soul," he whispered, his voice a cracked, demonic rasp. "I am going to send you to hell." "Julian," my voice was not a shout. It was a calm, steady command that cut through the tension of the room like a diamond blade. Julian froze. His entire body went rigid, slowly, agonizingly, as if terrified that turning around would shatter a fragile hallucination. He lowered the weapon and turned his head. I stood in the center of the ruined penthouse, my crimson coat vibrant against the monochromatic destruction. I was completely unscathed. My head held high, my eyes locked directly onto his. Julian's weapon slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the marble floor. The breath left his lungs in a rushing, broken gasp. "Clara," he whispered, his gray eyes widening in absolute, paralyzing disbelief. He took a stumbling step forward, his hands reaching out, trembling violently. "Clara, you died. I held you. You died. I am right here," I said softly, holding his gaze. "I am alive. Oliver is safe. You don't have to do this." "Julian." He crossed the remaining distance in a blur, dropping to his knees in front of me and burying his face in my stomach. His massive arms wrapped around my waist with bone-crushing force, holding me as if gravity itself might try to tear me away again. A guttural, tearing sob ripped from his throat, the sound of a monster dying and a man being reborn. I placed my hands on his wet, dark hair, holding him firmly, letting him anchor himself to my beating heart. "How touching," Victoria spat, her voice dripping with venom, though the confident smirk had finally vanished from her face. She stood up, her eyes darting frantically toward the shattered elevator doors. "A miraculous resurrection. Arthur, kill them both." Arthur tried to reach for a weapon, but Marcus stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, racking the slide of his shotgun with a deafening clack. Arthur froze, dropping his hands. "You don't give orders anymore." "Victoria," I said, stepping gently away from Julian, though I kept one hand firmly intertwined with his. I walked toward the matriarch, stopping just inches from her. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "You built an empire on fear," I told her, my voice echoing with absolute, terrifying calm. "You thought power was about who could inflict the most pain. But fear breaks. Victoria, fear turns into resentment, and resentment turns into rebellion. True power is loyalty, and you have absolutely no one left. As if on cue, the distant wail of police sirens began to rise from the city streets below. It was not just a few cruisers. It was a deafening, overwhelming chorus of federal sirens converging on the building. Simultaneously, the phones of the five elders huddled in the corner began to vibrate furiously. Donatelli, the head elder, looked at his screen, his face turning the color of ash. He looked up at Victoria, his eyes filled with homicidal rage. "You stole from the commission," Donatelli rasped, holding up the financial ledgers my invisible army had just broadcasted to the underworld. "You skimmed millions from the cartel truces. You sold out our routes to the feds to protect your own assets." "That's a lie," Victoria snapped, her aristocratic composure finally shattering into sheer panic. "It's a fabrication. She forged it. The FBI doesn't raid a building for forged metadata." "Victoria," I said coldly, gesturing toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. Below, heavily armored SWAT vehicles were already smashing through the lobby barricades. My network leaked everything. The trafficking, the embezzlement, the extortion. The feds are coming up the elevators right now to arrest you for federal racketeering and terrorism. But that's the least of your problems. I leaned in closer, dropping my voice to a whisper only she could hear. "The commission knows you stole from them. The Moreno cartel knows you framed them for kidnapping the Vance heir. If you survive federal prison, the cartels will hunt you to the ends of the earth. You are stripped of your wealth, your title, and your protection. You are nothing." Victoria stared at me, her icy blue eyes wide with the horrifying realization that her impenetrable fortress had been dismantled not by bullets, but by the women she had deemed invisible and worthless. For the first time in her life, the queen of the underworld was entirely, utterly powerless. "Julian," I said, turning my back on Victoria, dismissing her existence entirely. I held out my hand to the man who was still staring at me as if I were a living miracle. "Take me home to our son." Julian stood up. He looked at Victoria, the woman who had tormented him for years, the woman he had been ready to execute just minutes ago. But the homicidal rage was gone. He looked at her with nothing but absolute, freezing indifference. He reached out and took my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. As the heavily armed federal agents burst through the stairwell doors, screaming orders and aiming their rifles at the disgraced matriarch, Julian and I walked to the private executive elevator. We did not look back. We stepped into the glass box, leaving the ashes of Victoria's empire behind us, and descended into the city to reclaim our lives. 6 months later, the salt-heavy breeze of the Atlantic Ocean whipped through my hair, carrying the sharp, clean scent of the incoming tide. I stood on the sprawling wraparound porch of the coastal cedar cottage in Maine, leaning against the newly repaired wooden railing. The bullet holes in the cedar siding had been meticulously patched, the shattered glass replaced. The house bore the scars of a war, but it stood stronger than before. It was a fitting metaphor for the life we had built in the aftermath of the ashes. I held Eastming mug of black coffee, watching the horizon where the dark ocean met the bruised purple of the twilight sky. Behind me, the screen door whined open, and the heavy, rhythmic thud of small footsteps echoed on the wooden planks. "Mom, look." I turned and smiled as Oliver ran toward me. He was taller now, his face losing the fragile anxiety that used to permanently reside there. He was thriving, a boy who had finally learned that he did not have to constantly look over his shoulder. In his hands, he proudly presented his prized possession, the red toy car, Rocket. It was no longer charred and melted. It was perfectly, immaculately restored. The warped plastic had been smoothed and painted a brilliant, glossy cherry red. The missing back tire had been replaced with a custom-machined silver alloy wheel. It wasn't just fixed, it was upgraded. "It's beautiful, Ollie," I said, crouching down to admire the toy. "Who did the bodywork on Rocket?" "Papa did," Oliver beamed. his gray eyes shining with absolute adoration. He stayed up in the garage all night. He said Rocket deserved to be the fastest car in the world because he survived the fire. I looked up, my breath catching in my throat. Just as it did every single time he walked into a room, Julian emerged from the house, wiping a smear of motor oil from his hands with a rag. He wore faded jeans and a plain black t-shirt that stretched across the heavy muscles of his chest. The bruises and cuts from the warehouse had healed, leaving behind only faint silver lines that added to the rugged, dangerous architecture of his face. He was no longer the hollow, grief-stricken ghost I had met in the clinic. He was a man deeply anchored in his own humanity. Julian had not dissolved the syndicate. When the federal dust settled and Victoria was locked away in a maximum security black site, awaiting trial for a laundry list of federal crimes, Julian had returned to the city. But he did not return to the mahogany desk of his ancestors. He returned with Marcus and an army of fiercely loyal operators, and he systematically, violently purged the old guard. The commission was dismantled. The ancient, toxic laws of Omerta were rewritten in blood and fire. Julian consolidated his power, ruling the underworld with a terrifying, absolute authority. But the rules had changed. Under the new Vance Syndicate, human trafficking was eradicated with extreme prejudice. Extortion of innocent civilians was punishable by death. Julian became a monster only to the predators who preyed on the weak. To the rest of the city, he became a dark, invisible guardian, and my haven had risen from the ashes, funded entirely by the limitless, now heavily laundered resources of the Vance Empire. The new community center was a fortress of healing. It was 5 times the size of the original, equipped with top-tier medical facilities, legal teams, and a security perimeter designed by Marcus himself. The women of the Invisible Army were no longer invisible. They were protected by the most dangerous men in the city. I was the director. But in the whispers of the underworld, I was simply known as the Queen. "He's got a customized suspension system now," Julian said, walking over and placing a kiss on the top of Oliver's head. "Rocket can handle any terrain you throw at him. I'm going to test him on the rocks." Oliver cheered, sprinting off the porch and down the wooden stairs toward the private, jagged beach below. The trauma of his kidnapping replaced by the fearless joy of a child who knew his father was invincible. Julian stepped up beside me, wrapping his arms around my waist from behind, pulling my back flush against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, inhaling deeply. "You smell like coffee and sea salt," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down my spine. "It's my favorite combination." "You smell like motor oil and danger," I teased, leaning my head back against his shoulder. "I suppose I can live with it." Julian turned me around, gently taking the coffee mug from my hands and setting it on the railing. The playful light in his gray eyes shifted, darkening into something profoundly serious, heavy with a reverence that took my breath away. He reached into the front pocket of his jeans. He didn't pull out a gun, or a burner phone, or the keys to an empire. He pulled out a small, velvet box. My heart stalled. Julian stepped back, the ocean breeze ruffling his dark hair. He looked at me, taking in the crimson coat I still favored, the fierce, unapologetic strength in my posture. He did not ask me to submit. He did not ask me to hide behind him. He knelt on the weathered wooden planks of the porch, lowering his massive frame with a terrifying, beautiful grace. He opened the box. Inside, resting on black velvet, was a flawless, emerald-cut diamond ring, flanked by 2 deep red rubies. "I spent my entire life ruling people, Clara," Julian said, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of the crashing waves. "I was taught that power was domination, that love was a weakness that would get me killed. But you walked into a slaughterhouse without a weapon. You brought down an empire without firing a single bullet. You sacrificed your final breath to save our son. And in doing so, you saved my soul." Tears blurred my vision, hot and overwhelming. But I did not look away. "I don't want to rule the world anymore," Julian vowed, looking up at me with absolute, unwavering devotion. "I just want to walk beside you. I want to build an empire of our own, based on your rules, your heart, and your strength. You are my equal. Clara, you are my queen. Will you do me the absolute honor of becoming my wife? In truth, in light, and for the rest of our lives. I looked down at the man who terrified the city. The man who had rebuilt a toy car with the same hands that had torn down a mafia council. I saw the father of my child, the protector of my haven, and the absolute love of my life. Yes, I whispered. The word carrying the weight of 1,000 healed wounds. Yes, Julian. Always. Julian's face broke into a blinding, radiant smile. He slid the heavy, beautiful ring onto my finger, a perfect fit. He stood up, wrapping his arms around me and pulling me into a desperate, passionate kiss. It tasted of salt, of promises, and of a future we had fought through hell to earn, miles away, in the dark, rain-slicked alleys of the city we had left behind. The shadows were moving. Marcus Thorne, dressed in a heavy black trench coat, walked calmly down the abandoned loading dock of the industrial sector. The heavy silencer attached to the barrel of his customized sidearm gleamed dully under the flickering streetlights. Two men were kneeling on the wet asphalt in front of him. They were the last remaining lieutenants of Arthur Sterling's mercenary crew. The men who had helped kidnap Oliver and burn down the community center. The mercenaries were begging, pleading for a trial, for mercy, for a chance to disappear. Marcus looked at them with eyes as cold and unforgiving as the Atlantic Ocean. He thought of the terrified women screaming in the burning building. He thought of the bruised, charred red toy car. He thought of the boss, who was currently kneeling on a beach, asking the woman who saved them all for her hand in marriage. The boss had found his peace. The boss had found his humanity. But the boss had also given Marcus a final, absolute directive before he left the city. Protect the family, eradicate the rot. Leave no survivors who remember how to hurt her. The Vance Syndicate does not forgive, Marcus stated, his voice a mechanical, emotionless void, and the Queen does not suffer threats. Marcus raised the weapon. Two muted, suppressed cracks echoed in the alleyway. Swallowed instantly by the sound of the city's thunder, the bodies hit the pavement. Marcus holstered his weapon, stepping over the blood pooling in the rain, and melted back into the shadows to ensure the sanctuary remained unbroken. Back on the coast, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the world in a peaceful, enveloping twilight. Julian held me against his chest, watching Oliver race the red toy car over the jagged rocks of the shoreline, his laughter echoing over the roar of the tide. Julian Vance was a changed man. For his son, he was a hero. For his wife, he was an equal, a devoted partner who had learned how to love without cages. But to the rest of the world, to the monsters who lurked in the dark, he remained the most terrifying, lethal force in the criminal underworld. And as I leaned into his embrace, feeling the heavy, cold weight of the diamond on my finger and the steady, unbreakable beat of his heart against my back, I knew the ultimate truth. The king was a monster, yes, but he was my monster, and the queen beside him was just as deadly. As the dust settles on the ruins of Victoria Vance's shattered empire, and the coastal winds of Maine wash away the lingering shadows of the syndicate, we are left to reflect on the profound journey of Julian and Clara. At its core, this is not merely a tale of underworld dominance, gunfights, or the cold execution of rivals. It is a brutal, beautiful deconstruction of what it truly means to hold power. For so long, the mafia genre has glorified the man with the most guns, the highest body count, and the most impenetrable fortress. But this story flips that archaic narrative entirely on its head. It teaches us that traditional, tyrannical power, the kind built on fear, manipulation, and forced loyalty, is fundamentally fragile. Victoria Vance believed her ancestral laws and ruthless cunning made her a god, but her empire was systematically dismantled not by a rival cartel, but by the very people she deemed invisible and worthless. The true kings and queens of this world are not those who sit on gilded thrones demanding obedience, but those who inspire absolute loyalty through sacrifice, respect, and truth. Furthermore, this narrative redefines the concept of bloodlines and family. In a world where genetic lineage dictated destiny and survival, Julian and Clara proved that a true family is forged in the fires of choice, not the chains of DNA. Julian's ultimate victory did not come when he fired a weapon. It came when he dropped his gun in that steel warehouse, choosing to absorb the brutal physical punishment of the commission rather than risk the life of his son. It was in that agonizing moment of surrender that he shed the toxic skin of a mob boss and became a true father. The story vehemently argues that our pasts, our families of origin, and the dark systems we are born into do not have to dictate our futures. We possess the power to break generational curses, to rewrite the rules of our own empires, and to build sanctuaries from the ashes of our trauma. Julian's profound transformation serves as a crucial moral anchor for the audience. He began as a man trapped in a gilded cage, conditioned to believe that cruelty was the only currency that mattered. Yet, when faced with the absolute devastation of losing his family, he realized that the crown he wore was actually a collar. His redemption was not achieved through conquering enemies, but through surrendering his ego. When he ran into a burning building to save innocent women simply because Clara loved them, he proved that no soul is too far gone to be saved. The narrative challenges us to look beyond the scars and the terrifying reputations people carry, urging us to recognize the desperate, wounded humanity beneath. It demonstrates that true redemption requires tearing down the corrupt systems that created the monster in the first place. Just as Julian ultimately purged the syndicate to protect the vulnerable rather than exploit them. Perhaps the most blinding light in this dark underworld tale is the unyielding, terrifying strength of maternal love. Clara Hayes is the antithesis of the passive, helpless civilian wife. She is a general who weaponized her compassion, turning a network of abused, discarded women into an invincible army. Her journey reminds the audience that true strength does not require physical brutality. It requires the courage to walk into a slaughterhouse without a weapon, to lead with intellect over brawn, and to willingly trade your last breath to ensure your child keeps theirs. Her sacrifice fundamentally transformed a monster into a guardian, proving that love, when wielded with fierce, unapologetic conviction, is the most lethal and transformative force in the universe. Ultimately, this story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It is a promise that no matter how deep the darkness runs, no matter how absolute the corruption seems, the light of truth, loyalty, and fierce devotion will always find a way to burn it to the ground and start anew. This content was manually researched, developed, and edited by us to bring meaning and lessons.